My name is Leslie Jaggers, and I'm 25 years old now. There are words that are light, words you say without thinking, and then there are words that carry weight, words that feel sacred, earned, irreversible. For me, mom has always been one of those words. My mother died when I was 9. It wasn't something slow or merciful that gave us time to prepare. One day she was there, packing my lunch, reminding me not to forget my jacket, kissing my forehead before school, and the next day, she was gone in an accident that tore a hole straight through my childhood. After that, our house didn't feel like a home anymore. It felt like a place where everything echoed. My father tried to move on. I know he did. Over the years, there were a few women, a few awkward dinners, a few relationships that fizzled out before I could even learn their last names. None of them mattered much to me. None of them asked me for anything either. Until Julia. My dad met Julia when I was 16. She was 24, only 8 years older than me. I remember the first time I saw her standing in our living room, smiling like she belonged there already. She was young, confident, put together in a way that made me uncomfortable without knowing why. I remember thinking she looked closer to someone I might compete with than someone who would ever guide me. But I wanted to be fair. My dad seemed genuinely happy, happier than I'd seen him in years. And after everything we'd both been through, I didn't want to be the reason he felt lonely again. So I told myself that age was just a number, that relationships look different for everyone, that maybe this could work. She moved in within a couple of months. That should have been my first warning sign. But at 16, I didn't yet understand how fast things shouldn't move when someone is trying to secure their position. Not long after she brought her boxes into our house, Julia asked to talk to me. She chose the kitchen table like it was some kind of formal meeting. My dad stood behind her, leaning against the counter, pretending to scroll on his phone but listening to every word. Julia smiled at me. Not a warm smile, a practiced one. "I think it would really help us feel like a real family," she said gently, "if you started calling me Mom." The word landed between us like a dropped glass. For a second, I genuinely thought she was joking. I waited for her to laugh, to say she was kidding, to soften it somehow. She didn't. She just kept smiling, waiting for my answer like it was the most reasonable request in the world. I felt my chest tighten. I explained myself carefully. I told her that my mom had only been gone for 6 years. I told her that I wasn't ready, that I didn't feel that kind of bond with her yet, that maybe one day, if things developed naturally, we could figure out what to call each other. But right now, that word didn't belong to anyone else. I wasn't disrespectful, I wasn't cruel, I was honest. Julia's smile slipped for just a moment before she caught it again. From that day on, she was never the same with me. She didn't yell or insult me outright. That would have been too obvious. Instead, she started correcting me constantly, how I spoke, how I dressed, what time I came home. She'd insert herself into my decisions like she had some invisible authority over my life, and whenever I questioned it, she'd tilt her head and say, "I'm just trying to be a good mother." Every time she said that word, it felt like she was trying to force it into existence. When my dad was around, she was perfect, warm, pleasant, almost affectionate toward me. But when he wasn't, she'd go cold, ignoring me completely, or speaking to me like I was an inconvenience she hadn't signed up for. It was confusing and exhausting, and I couldn't figure out what I'd done wrong, other than refusing to call her something she wasn't. Whenever I pushed back, she'd complain to my dad, and then he and I would fight. At first, those fights ended in us making up. He'd say things like, "She's adjusting," or "She just wants to feel included." And because I loved my dad, I kept trying. I swallowed my discomfort. I told myself that if I gave it time, she'd relax once she felt secure. But Julia didn't want security. She wanted validation, control, proof that she had replaced someone who could never be replaced. When they got married 2 years later, I hoped, stupidly, that it would finally stop. That once she had the ring and the title of wife, she'd leave me alone. Instead, her obsession only grew stronger. A few months after the wedding, she sat me down again. This time, her tone was firmer. "Now that your father and I are married," she said, "it's time you accepted me as your mother. Calling me Mom would really complete this family." Something inside me snapped, not loudly, but permanently. By then, I'd seen who she really was. 4 years of subtle cruelty had stripped away any illusion I still had. I told her plainly that after the way she'd treated me, I had no interest in accepting her as my mother. I warned her that my mom wasn't a role to be filled, and that grief didn't make her position vacant. I told her to stop obsessing over something she could never force. That was the moment she stopped pretending. She went completely silent after that. Acted like I didn't exist. At the time, I thought that meant peace. I didn't know yet that silence was just her way of working in the background, turning my own father against me, one quiet lie at a time. Silence can feel like relief, until you realize it's being used as a weapon. After that last conversation, Julia stopped acknowledging me entirely. No more forced smiles, no more fake concern. If I walked into a room, she'd walk out. If I spoke, she'd look through me like I was furniture. At 18, I told myself I preferred it that way. At least she wasn't hovering, wasn't correcting me, wasn't insisting I call her something I couldn't. But peace built on silence never lasts. What I didn't know, what I couldn't see yet, was that Julia hadn't gone quiet. She'd gone strategic. Around the house, the rules began to change in ways that never quite traced back to her. My dad started commenting on my attitude. He asked why I was so distant, why I didn't make more of an effort. I'd stare at him, confused, because as far as I knew, I'd been giving them space. The space he'd asked for, the space he'd said would help. Julia feels like you don't like her, he told me one night, leaning against the doorway of my room. His voice wasn't angry, just disappointed, and that hurt more than anger ever could. I told him that wasn't true. I told him she barely spoke to me anymore. He frowned, genuinely puzzled, and said, "She says she keeps trying, Leslie. She says you shut her out." That was the first time I felt the ground shift under my feet. I started paying closer attention after that, watching patterns, listening to what was said, and what wasn't. Julia never raised her voice. She never criticized me when my dad was in the room. In fact, she was unfailingly polite then. She'd ask me about school, offer to make dinner, comment on how grown up I was becoming. And my dad ate it up. When he wasn't around, though, the mask slipped. Not dramatically, never enough to leave evidence, but just enough to remind me that I didn't belong. She'd sigh when I entered the kitchen. She'd reorganize things I used so I couldn't find them. She'd forget to tell me when plans changed. Small things, plausible things. Things that made me look unreasonable when I finally spoke up. Every time I tried to explain this to my dad, it sounded weaker, less convincing, even to my own ears. And Julia knew it. She knew that calm lies told consistently are more powerful than the truth told emotionally. By the time I left for college, the distance between my father and me wasn't something I imagined anymore. It was real, measurable. Phone calls got shorter. Texts went unanswered longer. When I came home for breaks, it felt like I was visiting someone else's house. Julia, meanwhile, seemed to glow. She talked openly about our family now, about what's best for us. And when people asked about me, she'd smile sadly and say, "Teenagers, you know, she's still grieving." It was clever, cruel, effective. I tried harder, I really did. I invited my dad to lunch, asked him to visit campus, called just to talk. He was always busy, or tired, or already had plans with Julia. I told myself it was normal, that marriages change priorities. I gave them space again. And Julia took all of it. The breaking point came during one of my surprise visits home. I thought, stupidly, that if I showed up unannounced, he'd be happy to see me. That maybe the distance would melt if he saw my face in front of him, not just through a phone. Instead, he looked annoyed. "I had dinner plans with Julia tonight," he said, checking his watch. "You should have called first." Something inside me cracked. I asked him why he never seemed happy to see me anymore, why he barely spoke to me, why it felt like he'd chosen her over me without ever saying it out loud. And then, because I was hurt, because I was young, because I still believed honesty mattered, I said her name. I said I knew this was Julia's doing. That's when everything exploded. My dad accused me of lying, of trying to turn him against his wife. He said Julia had done nothing but try to bond with me, and that I'd rejected her out of loyalty to my dead mother, as if love were a competition I needed to win. "She's been so patient with you," he said. "Do you know how hard she's tried?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I tried to explain. I told him about the coldness, the silence, the way she treated me when he wasn't around. He shook his head before I could even finish. "She would never do that," he said. "You're imagining things." That was when I understood how thoroughly she'd rewritten the story. According to Julia, I was the problem. I was jealous, resistant, unwilling to accept that my dad had moved on. She told him I ignored her, that I rolled my eyes at her, that I treated her like an outsider in her own home. And because she never slipped when he was present, because she'd built months of evidence through kindness and consistency, he believed her. Every word. The argument ended with an ultimatum I never saw coming. "If you can't respect my wife," he said, voice hard now, "then you can't live here." Respect apparently meant one thing. "Call her mom," he added, "or leave." I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I just looked at him, really looked at him, and realized I'd already lost him. I picked up my bag. I hadn't even unpacked yet. And as I walked out the door of the house I'd grown up in, I understood something that would take years to fully accept. Julia hadn't stolen my father. She'd simply given him permission to abandon me. I didn't have a plan when I left that house. I just knew I couldn't stay. The air inside felt heavy, like it was pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I remember standing on the porch for a moment after the door closed behind me, my bag at my feet, listening to the muffled sounds of the life I'd just been pushed out of. No footsteps followed me. No one called my name. That silence told me everything I needed to know. I drove straight to my uncle's place. He's my mom's older brother, the one person who had never let me feel like I was too much or in the way. Growing up, he'd been the adult who showed up to my school events when my dad was working late, who remembered my favorite snacks, who still talked about my mom like she mattered. When he opened the door and saw me standing there with my bags, he didn't ask questions at first. He just pulled me into a hug and said, "You're safe." That was when I finally broke. I told him everything that night, not just the ultimatum or the argument, but the 4 years leading up to it. The demand to call Julia mom, the coldness, the way she flipped the narrative when my dad wasn't looking, the slow way my father had slipped further and further away from me until I was the problem he needed to remove. By the time I finished, my uncle was furious. He called Julia a manipulative nightmare and my father an idiot for choosing a woman's ego over his own daughter. He told me, over and over, that I had done nothing wrong, that refusing to replace my mother wasn't disrespect, that grief doesn't have an expiration date. And then he did something my father never did. He chose me. Without hesitation, he told me I could stay as long as I needed. He said he'd cover my college tuition from then on, take care of my expenses, help me get on my feet. Not as charity, not as a favor, as family. I didn't ask him to tell anyone what happened, but he did anyway. He was too angry to stay quiet. Within weeks, both sides of the family knew what my father had done. Some relatives tried to talk sense into him, but he doubled down, insisting I was lying, dramatic, unstable. But the people who knew me, the ones who had watched me grow up, didn't believe him. They chose distance instead. And just like that, my father and Julia found themselves isolated. I didn't hear from them again. Not a text, not a call. 6 years passed in that silence. And in those 6 years, I built a life. I graduated. I interned at my uncle's real estate firm. I studied, worked, learned, failed, tried again. I earned my realtor's license. I moved into a better apartment in a safer neighborhood. I paid my own bills. I started paying my uncle back, even though he hated the idea. He'd say, "You don't owe me anything." And I'd answer, "I know, that's why I want to." He became more of a father to me than my biological one ever was. I thought that chapter of my life was over. I was wrong. 6 years after I walked out, my father showed up at my door. He looked older, smaller, tired in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with consequences. He told me his business had failed, that Julia had quit working years ago, that they'd had a baby, and then, almost casually, that she'd been injured in an accident and was now bedridden. He needed help. Money, childcare, forgiveness. I didn't even hesitate. I told him no. I told him I wasn't good with babies. I told him I wasn't responsible for the life he'd built after throwing me away. I told him that whatever sympathy I might have had died the day he chose Julia over me. He didn't take it well. He refused to leave. He said he'd gone to great lengths to find me, that family helps family, that I was being cruel. I told him he was being entitled. When he still wouldn't go, I threatened to call the police. That was the moment his mask slipped. He looked at me like I was the villain in his story. And for the first time, I realized something else. I wasn't angry anymore. I was done. I thought saying no would be the end of it. I really did. After my father left that day, stiff-backed, jaw clenched, humiliation written all over his face, I stood by my door for a long time, staring at the deadbolt like it might suddenly betray me. My hands were shaking, not because I regretted what I'd said, but because some old part of me had been dragged back to the surface. The part that still remembered being 16 and hoping he'd choose me. I called my uncle that night. I told him everything, about the visit, about the baby, about Julia's accident, about how my father had shown up not to apologize, not to make things right, but to use me. My uncle went quiet on the phone in that way he does when he's trying not to say something that might land him in jail. Then he told me something that made my stomach turn. My father hadn't gone to great lengths to find me. He'd been calling relatives for weeks, playing the victim, telling them how sick Julia was, how desperate they were. Most people ignored him. But eventually, someone on his side of the family, someone who barely knew me, gave him my address out of pity. So even that had been a lie. For a few days after his visit, I couldn't sleep properly. Every noise in the hallway made my heart jump. I hated that he still had that power over my nervous system, even after everything. So I did what I should have done years ago. I tightened my boundaries. Better locks, a camera, clear instructions with my building manager not to let him in. Because deep down I knew he wasn't done. I was right. A week later, I came home from work exhausted, shoes kicked off, mind already halfway to bed, when the doorbell rang. I didn't even have to look through the peephole to know who it was. I felt it in my chest before I saw him on the security screen. My father, standing there like he belonged. I didn't open the door. I spoke through the intercom and told him I wasn't willing to talk. He said he wasn't leaving until I listened. He said Julia had finally confessed, that she'd admitted she lied about everything, that she'd turned him against me, that he was sorry. Not sorry enough to leave, apparently. He kept talking, his voice rising, telling me to stop being so hard on him, to understand what they were going through, to cut them some slack. He spoke about my trauma like it was an inconvenience, something unfortunate that had happened but couldn't be helped now. "What do you want me to do about it?" he said. "It's in the past." That was when I called the police. I didn't warn him. I didn't hesitate. I just dialed and reported him for trespassing. While we waited, he kept banging on my door, his tone shifting from pleading to angry. He told me I was cruel, that I was heartless, that Julia was suffering, and this was my chance to prove I wasn't the selfish brat he'd always accused me of being. I stood there, phone still in my hand, heart pounding, but I didn't respond. When the officers arrived, everything fell apart for him. He started yelling, cursing, demanding to know how I could do this to my own father. I calmly explained the situation, the ultimatum, the 6 years of no contact, the fact that he'd already been told to leave. As they escorted him away, he didn't scream or fight. He just stared at me. And for the first time, I didn't feel small under his gaze. I felt free. 3 weeks passed without a word. Then a message came from an unknown number. It called me horrible, unforgiving, a terrible daughter. It said Julia wasn't the problem. I was. That I'd always been selfish, always cold, always incapable of caring about anyone but myself. That they regretted ever reaching out to me. I blocked the number without replying. A few days later, my uncle called with one final update. Apparently, my father had been kicked out of his own house. Julia's parents had moved in to help with the baby and her recovery, and my father was asked to leave. The reason? He'd suggested putting the baby into foster care temporarily because they couldn't handle things financially. Julia had exploded, threatened divorce, thrown him out. The irony wasn't lost on me. He threw me out when I needed him most. Now he knew exactly how that felt. I don't feel joy about it, or satisfaction, just clarity. I don't hate him anymore. I don't hate Julia either. I simply see them for who they are, and who they will never be for me. The only person I feel sorry for is the baby, my half-brother. He didn't ask for any of this. As for me, I finally understand something I wish I'd known at 16. Choosing yourself isn't cruelty. It's survival. For a long time after that, I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. I told myself it was over, that the police visit had finally drawn a line my father wouldn't cross again. But trauma doesn't disappear just because you've done the right thing. It lingers in the body, in the way your shoulders tense when the doorbell rings, in the way you check your phone twice before answering a message from an unknown number. Weeks passed, then months. No calls, no texts, no surprise visits. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, my nervous system began to calm down. I went back to focusing on my life. Work was busy in a good way. I had listings, clients, deadlines that didn't revolve around someone else's chaos. I spent more time with my uncle, cooked dinners together, talked about normal things. I laughed more, slept better. For the first time in years, I wasn't bracing myself for emotional impact. That's when I realized something uncomfortable. My father had only ever reached out when he needed something. Not when I graduated, not when I got my license, not when I moved into a better place. Only when his world was collapsing. That truth settled into me quietly, without drama. And once it did, the guilt I'd been carrying finally started to loosen its grip. Because guilt assumes responsibility, and I was no longer willing to carry responsibility for choices that weren't mine. Then, about 2 months after the police incident, I heard the final update. My uncle called me in the evening. His voice was calm, almost neutral, like someone delivering news that no longer had emotional charge. Julia and my father were still living separately. Her parents had taken over the house completely. My father was staying with a coworker, sleeping on a couch, barely scraping by. The business he'd started never recovered. His reputation took a hit after the whole foster care suggestion got around the family. People stopped returning his calls. Julia, according to my uncle, was telling anyone who would listen that she'd been betrayed, that she'd married the wrong man, that she'd sacrificed everything. I wasn't surprised. What surprised me was how little I felt when I heard all this. No anger, no satisfaction, no urge to comment, just distance. My uncle asked me if I was okay. I told him the truth. I said I was, and for once, I didn't feel like I was lying to make someone else comfortable. That night, I sat alone in my apartment with the lights off, city noise humming softly through the windows, and I thought about the girl I used to be, 16 years old, standing in her kitchen, being asked to call a stranger Mom, trying to explain grief to people who found it inconvenient. I thought about how desperately I'd wanted my father to see me, to believe me, to choose me. And I realized something else. Even if he showed up tomorrow, truly apologetic, fully aware, genuinely remorseful, it still wouldn't change the outcome. Because the damage wasn't the argument. The damage was the choice. He chose Julia when the stakes were highest. He chose comfort over truth, control over connection. And once that choice was made, it changed the shape of our relationship permanently. Some things don't break loudly. They fracture quietly and never fit back together the same way. I don't hate my father. I don't wish him harm. I don't sit around waiting for more karma to unfold. I've stopped telling this story as a warning or a lesson for him. I tell it because I know there are people out there, especially daughters, who've been told their boundaries are cruelty, that their grief is inconvenient, that respect means obedience. It doesn't. Respect is mutual, love is protective, and family should never require self-erasure as the price of belonging. I didn't lose a father the day I walked out of that house. I lost him the day he told me to replace my mother, or leave. Everything that happened after was just the echo of that moment. And I'm finally at peace with that.